All right, Umesh, do you want to start? Shall we start, or do you want to wait for a few more minutes? Uh, can you hear me, Umesh? Yeah. Okay. Cool. Cool. Yeah.
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay. Perfect. Okay. So maybe we can start since it's already 5 minutes since the 5:30. Okay. So I've just started recording, and this talk will be available afterwards as well. I think Nandini and others will share it with everyone. So, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the webinar on the Protect Mollem campaign. I'm Akshay. I'm a PhD student. I study tropical forests, and the first few times I was in a rainforest was in Mollem and Kotigao and other forests of Goa. So, I'm happy to be here. And as you're aware, this webinar is part of the Protect Mollem series, where we have ecologists, naturalists, and everyone else who study nature share their stories with us to better understand what would happen to biodiversity as a result of these projects. Um, Today, we're all excited to have Umesh Srinivasan with us. Umesh is a freshly minted assistant professor at CES in the Indian Institute of Science. Previously, he was a postdoc at Princeton, and before that, a PhD student at the National Center for Biological Sciences, and much before that, an actual medical doctor. So, welcome, Umesh. Umesh is primarily interested in all forms of global change, especially land use and climate change, and the impact of global change on biodiversity. His current work focuses on understanding how synergies between climate warming, forest degradation, and other forms of global change impact the behavior, demography, and the structure of and function of bird community in the Himalayas. But besides research, he also works with the Bugun community of Singchun village in Arunachal and with the Arunachal Forest Department on a range of conservation issues. These include wildlife and nature education for school children from Arunachali tribal communities and the management of the Bugun Village Conservation Reserve, which was established to protect the critically endangered Bugun Leo Chikla. He's also a signatory of several letters to the MOEF with regard to this Protect Mollem campaign and several others to protect forests of India. Today, he's going to talk to us about forest fragmentation and its impact on biodiversity. This is very relevant to what's happening to the forests of Mollem, where a railway and road expansion and a brand new transmission line will further fragment what is a continuous patch of forest. So, looking forward to this talk, and over to you, Umesh. Uh,
Well, thank you, Akshay, and it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me discuss forest fragmentation and its effects on biodiversity with all of you this evening. And to start off with, I must congratulate all of you for setting up a movement of this magnitude, bringing together people from all walks of life. It's really an inspirational movement. So, congratulations. Um, Let me just share my screen. And can you see my screen, Akshay?
yes, it's not in full screen though.
Um, so today, I just want to discuss the effects that forest fragmentation has on biodiversity. And forest fragmentation is a huge problem, especially in tropical areas across the world and affecting tropical forests. And what's happening with tropical forests is that a lot of forest land is being cleared for various purposes. You know, it could either be for agriculture or for plantations like rubber or oil palm, or for cutting down forests to create grazing land for cattle and so on. So there are several reasons why forests, especially in the tropics, are being cleared today. And what that does is, as forests are cleared, it leaves these little tiny patches of remnant forest behind. So what's happening is, where you had large continuous tracts of forest in the past, this clearing of forest land fragments the forest. It leaves behind tiny little patches of forest which are much smaller than the original forest extent, and they're also isolated from each other. So you can see a forest fragment at the bottom left of your screen. You can see a forest fragment at the top middle of your screen. They're both separated from each other. So they're isolated from each other by what's called the matrix, which is the intervening area over here, which could be either of many things. Um, just a second.
Umesh, sorry to
Yeah, it's
interrupt.
not in
Yeah,
full screen. Let me
yeah.
just. There we go. So, so fragmentation leaves behind small isolated patches of forest which are separated from each other by something called the matrix. Now, that matrix which you see over here, in this case, is a plantation, but it could be many things. It could be a tea plantation, it could be a rubber plantation, it could be agriculture, it could be, grazing land for cattle and so on. So the matrix also has a bearing on how much forest fragmentation affects biodiversity. This is a map that shows you tropical regions across the world. There's the Americas, Africa, and Asia and Australia. And what it shows you is the distribution of forest patches of different sizes. If you could just focus on the graph that's on the bottom left over here, what you have on the x-axis is fragment size. So to the left of the x-axis are small fragments. As you go towards the right, fragment size is increasing and you have larger and larger fragments. And the y-axis is actually count of the number of fragments in these different size classes. So you can see that small fragments over here, which are about 10 hectares in size, there are a lot of those fragments. And as fragment size increases, the number of fragments comes down quite drastically. So what you see in today's world in the tropics are a large number of very, very small fragments and very few large contiguous areas of forest land. And as we'll see further, the size of the fragment has a huge bearing on what kind of biodiversity it can support. So the fact that there are so many of these small fragments and very few large fragments is actually a cause for concern. Now, forest fragmentation, we know from studies across the world, has massive impacts on biodiversity and species, the way in which they can survive, the way in which they behave. It also has huge effects on carbon and the ability of forests to retain carbon, which is a huge concern given the ongoing climate crisis, right? Now, excuse me, I won't talk much about carbon except for showing you a quite frightening graphic. But the ways in which forest fragment affects biodiversity are mostly three direct effects that fragmentation has. That is the reduction in area of forest patches, the fact that forest patches then get isolated from each other, and edge effects. The fact that earlier in huge continuous tracts of forest, you have an edge of the forest, but fragmentation actually increases the length of those edges greatly. So you can see in this picture, this particular forest fragment has a large edge and a very sharp edge that's very different from the matrix that surrounds it. And those edge effects also have massive impacts on biodiversity. And finally, we'll talk a little bit about other indirect effects that forest fragmentation has. But let's just look at area reduction and carbon um, to begin with. So fragmentation reduces forest patch area. On the left, what you can see is a map of the island of Borneo. In 1950, all of Borneo almost was covered in forest. And as we're going over time, by 2020, the amount of forest left in Borneo is very, very little. And all of that forest is fragmented to some degree or the other. So you can see a pretty large fragmented patch at the bottom of Borneo over there, and a series of other smaller patches of forest fragments throughout the landscape. So what this is doing is taking a large patch of forest and reducing. Not only is forest cover being lost, but the remnant forest is also of much smaller area than you would have otherwise. And this is playing out everywhere in the tropics. On the right is a map of the Brazilian Atlantic forest, which is one of the most threatened biomes in the world. And again, you can see in light the area that used to be forest, and now it's been fragmented into patches of varying sizes, which are indicated by the dark areas. So it reduces patch area, and this does have an effect on the carbon that a forest patch can sequester. This is a study that looked at the amount of carbon that is lost from forest fragments. Now, on average, a tropical forest holds per hectare about 150 to 160 tons of carbon. So the growing trees, they sequester, or they take in carbon, and they hold that carbon in solid form, not allowing carbon dioxide to go out in the air and act as a greenhouse gas. But what you see, and I'll just focus on this little square in Africa, in the Congo basin, what you can see over here is a color coded map of how much carbon is being lost from different fragments, which is on the left over here. So the larger fragments are losing about 1 to 3 tons of carbon per hectare. And the smaller fragments at the bottom of that square are actually losing between 17 to 40 tons of carbon per hectare. So forest fragmentation does have an impact of climate change, in that solid carbon that is sequestered in trees is now being lost. It's becoming gaseous carbon that goes out into the atmosphere and aggravates global warming. But what I'll talk a little more in detail about is the impacts on biodiversity. Now, if you look at area and fragment area, this has huge consequences for how many species a forest fragment can support. Again, over here, if you look at the graph on the left side, what you have on the x-axis is fragment area. It's on a log scale. So you've got fragments of 1 hectare, 10 hectares, 100 hectares, and 1,000 hectares on the x-axis. What you have on the y-axis is the number of species in each fragment. And I want to draw your attention to this solid black line over here, which shows you that the number of species that are in a forest fragment of just 1 hectare is about 12 to 13 species. But as fragment size increases and you get to larger and larger fragments, actually the number of species also rises. And you get in these very large fragments about 40 species. So forest fragmentation is happening in this landscape, but the fact that it's creating fragments of different sizes also means that the number of species that these different fragments can accommodate is very, very different. Larger fragments have more species, smaller fragments have a fewer number of species. And that happens largely because there are species that are area sensitive. So species that has a very large home range, like a tiger or an elephant, or a number of hornbill species that need to range widely to find enough food to eat, because fruiting trees that they feed on might be spaced, right across the landscape. They will not be able to find enough resources, enough food in a small fragment, and those tend to be the first species that disappear. So I'll look at the graph on the right over here. Again, it's fragment area on the x-axis, small fragments on the left side, large fragments on the right side, and on the y-axis is body size, the body size of a bird. So you can see with these bars that these smaller species at the bottom basically are found throughout fragments of all different sizes. So if the colored bar spans the entire area, that means that this species is found across all fragment sizes. But but as size increases and you get to these trogons and these frugivores, toucans, which are very much like our hornbills, and these large ground dwelling species, they're entirely absent from the smaller fragments. So this area on the axis, this shows you basically the area that has smaller fragments, and that shows you body size. So the larger birds are only in the larger fragments, whereas the smaller birds tend to do fine across the entire range of fragment sizes. So fragmentation affects large species. It affects species that are at higher trophic levels, like apex predators, top carnivores like tigers, like hawk eagles, and so on, which are carnivores at the top of the food chain. Those tend to be the first to disappear from forest fragments. And that has huge impacts in terms of the functioning of the forest. If you lose large hornbills from a forest fragment, then tree regeneration, because hornbills actually eat fruits and disperse the seeds widely, allowing them to regenerate other parts of the forest, that function that these hornbills provided earlier in the past is now entirely absent from smaller fragments. So it's not just about the loss of species, it's also about the loss of what the species do. And that then has more and more impacts as you go along in time, changing, for example, because of the loss of hornbills, the tree community in the forest. So it's, again, it's not just about the loss of species, it's the loss also of the function of the species and the functioning of the ecosystem that happens because of the loss of these area sensitive species. This is a graph that shows you these large circles are species over here, and the black lines that connect these circles are interactions between species. So no species lives alone. It interacts with other species. It might compete with the species, it might gain benefits from another species, and so on. So species are embedded in an interaction network. And these interaction networks with multiple species, as you can see in these circles, are all interacting with each other in primary forest or undisturbed forest. But that same bird community, if it's in a forest fragment, those interactions are broken down. And so you have a lot of these species at the periphery over here that are not connected to this entire interaction network at all. These species are now, in effect, living in isolation, that they're not interacting with other species in that network. So the loss of species is one thing, but it also alters species behavior. And species behavior is an important part of their ability to survive and thrive in forested landscapes. And that is severely compromised in forest fragments like this. Because simply because beneficial species interactions break down and that no longer occur in forest fragments for a variety of reasons. So that was a brief look at what area does to species. Let's look at isolation. Excuse me. Now, isolation means that a particular forest fragment is very, very far from the nearest large forest area. So, if you have a large wildlife sanctuary, 500, 600 square kilometers, that's the large area. And then you have forest patches of different sizes in that landscape, but they're also at different distances from that large area that can severely compromise their ability to hold species, because species have to move to occupy these small fragments from the larger forest patch, and the matrix between the larger forest patch and these small tiny fragments determines whether species will be able to move from larger forest patches to tiny little fragments. And so this graph shows you with trees in the Amazon, the x-axis is basically a measure of isolation. It's the distance to the nearest large forest patch. So zero means it's right abutting the forest patch. There's no difference or no distance between the forest patch and the fragment itself. And as you go along to farther and farther forest fragments, some of them can be about 2 kilometers, 1.8 kilometers far away from the large forest area. What you can see clearly from this graph is the y-axis there is the number of species that you have in these fragments. Fragments which are very close to forest patches tend to have a large number of tree species. And as you go further and further away from the larger forest patch, which contributes species, the number of species in these more and more isolated forest fragments comes down. So the farther away a forest patch is from a large forest area, the lesser number of species it's going to be able to support. And that happens for a variety of reasons. For example, if you looked at mammals or insects that won't be able to move across a matrix that is hostile. So if your matrix is pasture land, grazing land for cattle, then very few species will will have the ability to cross large areas of pasture to reach another forest patch. So that acts as a barrier between isolated forest patches and larger forest areas. In addition, for trees, if they're being dispersed by hornbills or other birds, then the birds themselves are not going to fly from large forest areas to smaller and more isolated forest patches, and that then prevents the seeds of these tree species from arriving at these little forest patches that are very far away. and decreases the number of tree species that you would expect to find in a more isolated patch. So this is a very interesting study about isolation that was done in the Brazilian Amazon, where they looked at gaps between two forests. And again, on the x-axis here is gap width. So if you have a gap between two forest patches, that gap can be either very small, let's say 1 meter, or the gap can be very large, 1,000 meters or 1 kilometer. So you could have distances between these forests that vary greatly, right? So at the right side end of these graphs are two forest patches that are separated from each other by 1 kilometer. And what they did was to sit and to look at these gaps and to measure the number of times birds cross these gaps of different sizes. And you can see when the gaps are relatively small over here, let's say about 5 kilometers, 5 meters, I'm sorry, in width, a lot of species tended to cross those gaps. But as the gaps became larger and wider to reach about, let's say, 500 meters, there were almost no crossings between one forest patch to the other forest patch. So, and this, so a lot of species that were able to cross above the canopy, above the trees, they were flying over trees like these macaws and larger parrots, didn't really bother about the size of the gap. But for a whole lot of species that live in the forest canopy, the upper layers of the forest, or the mid story, the middle layers of a forest, or the understory, species that feed on the ground, or species that feed on bushes that are very close to the ground, gap size is critical. They were able to cross relatively small gaps, but as gap size increases, the number of crossings went down to zero. So fragmentation and isolation have huge effects on the ability of species to cross from one forest patch to another. This is again a very interesting study. What you see in these polygons with these little black squares inside them are the home ranges of a particular species. So if you look at this polygon over here, that's the home range of this species, and these dots are just the locations where that species was recorded by researchers working in the field. And you've got, based on these locations that they recorded, a home range of this size. Uh, and the size of the home range is between 11 to 12, 11 to 13 hectares. Now, what happens when you put a road in at the bottom left? You can see the kind of road that went through this forest, basically effectively fragmenting it, separating these two forest patches from each other. And when they did that, what they found was birds were so reluctant to cross even these tiny little roads. We tend to think of a kacha road or a mud road as something that doesn't have too many important effects on species behavior. But what actually happens is over here, look at the road is here in the bottom, shown to you over here. The species home ranges all stopped at the road. So where the species home ranges in the past could have been this big or that big, once the road comes in, because of the reluctance of these species to cross, their home ranges just get truncated. Their home ranges become much smaller because the road is now a barrier to movement, even small roads like this. And it's been shown from a variety of studies that the birds that you tend to see closer to roads are very different from the birds that you see in the interior of the forest. So small linear intrusions like a power line or a road or a railway track can have huge impacts on the bird community, or wildlife communities in general. And roads, obviously, and railway tracks, of course, bring with them the fact that the forest is fragmented. A lot of species are unable to remain in small forest patches. They need to move from one forest patch to the other, and that results in mortality. Elephants, tens of elephants are killed by trains every year in North Bengal and other places because of collisions with trains. A huge variety of wildlife in the country is killed on roads because of roadkill. So, in their attempt to cross over from one forest fragment to another forest fragment, they're hit by vehicles. And this is not just large species like leopards or tigers or deer or elephants. These are also, Excuse me. These are also species that are small, insects, butterflies, especially at night when the headlights of these vehicles are on. Insects are attracted to these headlights, and then they face mortality and they die because of collision with these vehicles. So it also has indirect effects. This might not be a direct effect of forest fragmentation, but because there is vehicular traffic and the process that created fragmentation was explicitly to create greater vehicle traffic, explicitly to run trains on, this has compounded effects in addition to fragmentation that are very, very harmful for wildlife. There is something called extinction debt, and I'll go over this very briefly. If you want to start off with looking at the right side graph, which has two lines in light gray and in black, again, the bottom is fragment area, larger fragments to the right side, smaller fragments to the left. And what you have on the y-axis is the number of plant species. Now you can see in both these cases, the lines go upwards. They go towards the top right, which means that larger forest fragments have a greater number of plant species. But it's not that simple. When fragmentation occurred in 2003, the small fragments had about 50 plant species and the large fragments had about 100 plant species. But when you go back in 2013 and look at the same pattern, the number of plant species has dropped drastically in the same fragments. So what you have in 2013, instead of 50, about 50 for plant species in the small fragments, you have about 30 small species. It's a loss of 20 species. Similarly, you've got about 100 tree species in the large fragments, but that's dropped down to about 50. So the number of plant species over the course of 10 years has halved in these forest fragments. And that's something that we call extinction debt. The moment you fragment a forest and you clear the area, it doesn't mean that the species will vanish immediately. What is going to happen is some species are going to persist. These might be area sensitive species. This might be large carnivore species at higher trophic levels, sensitive plant species be found in forest fragments as soon as you fragment the area and if you did a survey in these fragments. But they will not be effectively able to reproduce in these small fragments. They will not be able to effectively replace mortality by adding new individuals into the population. And therefore, over time, they will die and they will become locally extinct from these forest fragments. So there is a debt in extinction from these forest fragments that need to be paid. And that debt is apparent only over time. When you see that you go to the same forest fragments after 10 years and you see that the number of species that these fragments support is much, much lower because of these species dying out in these fragments over time. So that's the concept of extinction debt. So a survey that's done in a forest, in a set of forest fragments immediately after fragmentation is going to show a much larger number of species than the forest fragments actually are able to support over the long term. On the left is a graph that shows you small mammal species on a set of these forest fragments. Um, 5 to 7 years after fragmentation on large islands, there were about, on average, 4 mammal species. 25 to 26 years after forest fragmentation, there is only 1 mammal species. The same pattern that you see with small islands. In general, small islands can support a lower number of species than large islands. So you see 5 to 7 years after fragmentation, about 2 species on every island, but then you're left behind with only 1 species years after fragmentation. So species like this tree shrew basically disappeared from all these forest fragments, and the only species that was left behind was a rat. And rats, can survive in human dominated landscapes. They can survive in cities and towns and so on. So it's not surprising that the only species that was left behind on these fragments was a species of very little conservation concern, whereas a lot of species that were important for conservation, rare species, basically disappeared from these fragments. Now, let's talk about edges and the matrix and what influence that has on species. Now, the x axis is habitat quality. Here's primary forest. It's forest that has never been fragmented. As you move to the right, you get a small 10-hectare forest patch that is surrounded over here by a relatively hostile matrix, small shrubby vegetation that doesn't allow birds to move from one patch to the other. And after 5 years, the regrowth of these intervening areas between the fragments has grown a little more, and it's become slightly more favorable for these rainforest birds. Now, what you see on the y-axis is survival rate. So survival is basically if you have a 0.2 probability of surviving from 1 year to the next, it means that 20% of the population will survive, whereas 80% of the population will die between 1 year and the next. And you see in primary forest for these three species, one of which is here on the right side, which is the white plumed ant catcher, you see that their survival rates are pretty high in primary intact forest, between 60 to 80%. So 60 to 80% of the population survives from 1 year to the next, which is a pretty high percentage of birds surviving. When you fragment the forest, almost immediately after fragmentation, these survival rates drop greatly to about 40 to 50%. So, where you had 60 to 80% of birds surviving, the effects of forest fragmentation has now led to a drastic drop in the probability of these birds surviving from 1 year to the next. And survival probability is a huge, huge predictor of whether birds can remain, whether the populations can remain viable in these altered habitats. And these low survival rates tend to indicate that forest fragments are not going to be able to support viable populations of these birds over the long term. Now, as the forest fragment is surrounded by a matrix with regeneration, some forest is starting to come back. The survival rates are also going up over time, but not reaching as high as they were in the primary forest patch. So where you have a 75% survival for this species in primary forest, the probability of this survival of this species in a forest fragment, even with a better matrix, is only about 55%. So this brings us to the matrix itself and the effect of the matrix on species, uh, which we look at edge effects. So you can see over here that this fragment is surrounded by agriculture and it's a very hard edge. By a hard edge, I mean that the habitat, the forest habitat itself, is extremely different from the habitat that surrounds it. So a bird that reaches the forest edge and then looks out and sees just short grass everywhere is not going to make an attempt to try and cross that barrier because that habitat is completely alien to it. This is becoming a huge problem across the world. This is a map of the world that shows you in a color code for every forest patch how far that forest patch has habitats that are at different distances from the edge. So small forest fragments will obviously be very close to the edge. Larger forest fragments and large contiguous areas of forest areas will have habitats that are very, very far from the edge. So this dark blue color shows you patches of forest that have areas that are more than 1 kilometer from the edge, whereas the red shows you patches of forest that are very, very close, that have edges all around them. So there is no part of that forest fragment that is less than 100 meters from an edge, right? So the red, and if you look at these maps over here, really the only significant large tracts of forest that we have are in the Amazon basin and the Congo basin in Africa. In the rest of the world, pretty much you're left with tiny little forest fragments with huge edge areas around them, and therefore, you have those fragments which are where all of them are, only 100 meters from the edge, or 200 to 200 meters from the edge, and so on. So globally, edges are becoming more and more common. And we want to see what effects do these edges have. They can have huge effects. The fact that there is an edge between a forest and the matrix outside it has very great effects on the environment of the edge of the forest itself. So there's a lot more wind coming into the forest because the forest area is now open to wind coming in at that edge. The temperature rises, moisture comes down, and therefore what you have at the edge of a forest fragment rather than the interior of a forest fragment are hotter and drier habitats because moisture's come down and temperature's gone up. So the hotter and less moist that the habitat is, it makes it more prone to fire. So smaller fragments are much more prone to getting burnt down than larger fragments where the edge is very, very far away from the forest interior. Um, the edges also encourage the proliferation of invasive species. These are species that are not native to the habitat. They're not found in the region, but they've been brought in from somewhere else and they've escaped into the wild. And these edges, habitat edges, allow these invasive species to basically proliferate and replace native species. And why does that happen? If you look at the graph on the right side, this shows you on the x-axis distance from the forest edge. So, and the percentage of trees that are either standing and dead or that have fallen down. So basically dead trees is what you see in these bars and the percentage of dead trees. So when the distance from the edge is less than 60 meters, so when you're very, very close to the edge, what's happening is about 10 to 12% of forest trees are simply dying, toppling over and dying, which is a huge number because if you go into the interior of the forest, the proportion of trees that die is about 2%. So you're moving from an interior of the fragment where you've got very low tree mortality, which can be replaced by seedlings and saplings and regeneration, to the edges where you have massive, massive tree mortality. And that again not only decreases the number of trees and the species of trees in a forest fragment, it also opens up this area for fire and invasion by invasive species. Species interactions again have a huge bearing on effects of the edge. So this is on the right side. What you can see is a plant that's being eaten by caterpillars. So this plant is being damaged by herbivory, by caterpillars eating it. And I just want to point out over here on the right side, this solid black line shows you 20 meters from the edge, what is the percentage of the leaves that have been eaten. And the light gray line over here shows you that right within the fragment, more than 100 meters away from the edge, what is the percentage of plants that have been eaten. So in the interior of the forest, which is very, very far away from the edge, you see about 10% of leaves being damaged by herbivory, by insects, by being eaten by insects. Whereas if you go to a forest, if you go to the edge area, which is less than about 20 meters from the edge, that is the exterior part of the forest, the damage is no longer 10% of the leaves, it's 40% of the leaves. So you have these interactions between species also changing because of these fragment edges. In this case, much, much larger leaf damage at the edge of the forest fragment than in the interior of the forest fragment. So basically, to summarize, this is to say that the interior of the forest fragment differs very much from the edge of the forest fragment in terms of environmental conditions. The interiors is cool and moist, the edges are warm and dry, and that has a huge impact on how species can interact with each other and which species can survive in these various areas. And obviously, in a small fragment, you have a lot more edge than interior. And a large fragment, you have relatively little edge than a much safer interior. So the small fragments bear the brunt of not just area, but also these large edge effects. Um, yeah. Now, one of the most important things that forest fragments do is they allow humans to change their behavior and they increase access to forests that otherwise might have been inaccessible. So these other effects, uh, are that one, forest fragmentation encourages further forest fragmentation. Just look at this map over here on the left side, where you've got a road coming through the Brazilian Amazon. But because the road has come through, if there was no road here, people would not be coming into this large patch of forest, large area of forest. But because the road has come through over here, this main highway, it's made this forest more accessible to people. And therefore, people have now built secondary roads going away from the highway, further fragmenting the habitat. So the road itself, which is a driver of fragmentation, has created the ability of people to go in and further fragment the habitat. So fragmentation compounds fragmentation. Uh, Again, fragmentation because of humans and species that live with humans has other impacts which might be quite unexpected. X-axis is the distance from the edge. So 1,000 meters is the interior of the forest, 1 kilometer away from the edge. 0 meters is right at the forest edge. And the probability of finding a domestic dog or a feral dog at the edge, right at the edge, is about 80%. By about 400 to 500 meters, you don't find feral dogs inside these fragments anymore. The probability of finding a feral dog in the interior of the forest is zero. What that does is that it pushes native species like this maned wolf away from the edge, further restricts the area of forest that they're able to occupy and they're able to forage in and able to use. So these are impacts that are are indirect. It's because of the fact that humans can now access these forests because of these large edges, and species that live with humans, invasive species or domestic dogs, are also able to access these patches. So not only is the forest patch itself becoming smaller, more isolated, and having a greater edge, it's also bringing in species that further restrict the ability of native and endangered species like the maned wolf within the remnant forest patches that exist. And finally, talk about hunting. These are large game birds. At the bottom of your screen on the left side, you can see a large game bird that was studied in these forest patches that are shown in black in Brazil. And on the y-axis is abundance, how many individuals of each species there are, and these six different panels represent six different species of these birds, of these game birds that are much sought after by hunters. And you can see at the edge, you pretty much don't have any of these birds at all. But as you go further and further into the forest interior, the abundances of these birds rises, sometimes quite drastically. In the case of this third species here and the sixth species here, the abundance really goes up in the interior of the forest than at the edge. And it's thought that this is entirely because of hunting, because hunters are able to access these edge areas. They might be reluctant to go into more interior areas, and therefore, uh, forest fragmentation also allows for access and brings in a whole lot of other indirect impacts that you wouldn't see in large continuous forest patches. So just to summarize, forest fragmentations are much smaller, obviously, than large areas. So the area of the fragment itself is a reduction from the larger forest from larger forest areas. They're isolated, they're embedded often in a hostile matrix that species are reluctant to cross. So even though there might be species in the larger forest area, they would not be able to cross the matrix to occupy um, these isolated fragments. So area and isolation acting together severely reduces the number of species that you find in forest fragments. The edges can have huge effects. They change the environment. They make them hotter and drier, encouraging fire and encouraging invasive species to proliferate. And then you have these indirect effects from human beings who bring in invasive species, bring in predators like dogs, uh, and also go in themselves to hunt. You know, so the fragmentation itself has all these other indirect effects as well. So that's just a very broad sort of idea of what forest fragmentation does to biodiversity uh, through these four broad mechanisms. I'll stop there. Thank you very much for having me. I hope you found this useful, and I'll be happy to have a discussion or take any questions that people have.
Thank, thank you so much, Umesh. That was great.
Um,
Mm,
Akshay, I
I think.
can't hear you very clearly. Could you hold the mic up a little closer to you?
Yeah, thank you so much, Umesh. I said. Can you hear me? Hello, can you hear me? Can you hear me now?
Where do I? Um,
Anyway, I think we can open up for questions now if people have any questions. Um, okay, thanks. If you have any questions, please feel free to unmute, either put your question in the chat or unmute and ask. Uh, I think we have about 10 minutes, maybe, a few questions. Umesh, can you hear me now? Hello? Okay, I think some audio issue. You're muted, Umesh. Uh, can't hear you. If you can wait for a few minutes, maybe.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can now.
Akshay, can you hear me?
Yes, yes. Can you?
I'm not getting anything.
I can. Yeah, yeah.
All right, I can see the chat box now. I think the first question is can you clearly and do we know the level of fragmentation in Mollem? Um, well, we do know the fact that the widening of the railway track, the doubling of the railway track, and the fact that even NH4A is to be widened and doubled, which was, I think, in the past a 7 meter broad road, but now that's going to be doubled to 14 meters. The look, I mean, I'll start off by saying that all the forest areas in India are already fragmented. So what we have right now is relatively small patches of forests and protected areas that are spread throughout the length and breadth of our country. So they're already fragmented, and the effects of fragmented can already be seen. Uh, Mole itself, the area of Mole itself, is not yet fragmented to a great extent. But definitely the coming in of the doubling of the railway track and the widening of the NH4A to twice the width is going to result in much greater fragmentation that you see today. And simply a tar road broadening to two times its earlier width and having high-speed trains coming in from both directions through Mole is going to have massive impacts on one, the ability of species being able to cross from one side of Mollem to the other, thereby reducing the home ranges, basically cutting off the home ranges of species that would use otherwise both sides of that area. And it's going to create a lot more roadkill and deaths because of collisions with trains and so on. Right. How many years until the forest sees its first local extinction due to fragmentation? That's from Malavika. Um, Also considering that there is an endemic damselfly in Mole with habitat close to the track, what impact, I guess the question is, that this railway track might have on this endemic damselfly? Um, how many years it takes to actually see a local extinction in a forest fragment is very much determined by the species that you see in the larger forest area before fragmentation. So it's basically related to the size of the species. It's basically related to the home ranges of these species. How much area do they require? So, in some forest fragments in the Amazon and in Africa, and this is very unfortunate because we don't have studies of fragmentation really, apart from one or two cases from India itself. And it's always a little difficult to say, because these many species went extinct in these many years in forest fragments in the Amazon. That's the time frame that we're also going to see in India in forests in Mole. So it's a little difficult to answer that question, but you can safely say that it's the large species that are going to go extinct first. It's it's species that have large requirements in terms of habitat that are going to go extinct first, followed by species that are smaller and smaller. So the smaller species will take a longer time to go extinct from forest fragments than large species. Uh, the endemic damselfly in Mole, unfortunately, I study birds, so I'm not familiar with invertebrate biology at all. Um, and whether this endemic damselfly is endemic because it requires certain kinds of microhabitats, does it require particularly wet habitat next to a stream? Does it require, areas that have sun from a certain point in time to a certain point in time? It's difficult to say what impact the damselfly might face. But if they're, for example, migratory, and they migrate from one part of the forest to other, use different habitats in summer and winter, then obviously the probability of them getting killed by vehicles, killed by trains, and so on, will be very, very high, and much higher than a species that is restricted to a particular habitat. So it's difficult to answer the question about how many years it would take. What we can safely say, though, is that large species will go extinct first, and that will certainly happen in forest fragments. There's no doubt about that. Followed by smaller and smaller species, and it'll only be a subset of species that will be left behind in forest fragments, and those are generally species that are able to tolerate, some degree of human modification, and are found in other places as well, not of conservation concern. So Neeta Ganguly has a question. Thank you for the presentation. These are well studied and documented facts that clearly warn the ill effect of fragmentation of forests. In spite of knowing the science, it is given a backseat. How can one overcome this? This really is a problem that is faced with infrastructure projects that the government takes up across the country and across the board. We do have enough information to say a dam coming in, or a road coming in, or a fragment or forest fragmentation is going to have massive impacts on biodiversity. And it is an uphill task. It is a massive battle to convince the proponents of these projects that this biodiversity matters, and also the fact that what they're going to be doing in that forest area building infrastructure, roads, and all its attendant, quarters for people, you know, all that is going to have impacts on biodiversity. We know that, like you say, we know that. But, you know, at the moment, it seems that the more effective way to deal uh, with the government and to deal with project proponents and to deal with the bureaucracy is not say here's the science. That's definitely not enough. I mean, nobody's going to say here's the science. If you've looked at the EIAs, uh, I mean, the EIA and the quality of these EIAs really is pretty poor, and in some cases abysmal. And first of all, that's the standard of science that the government uses. Contracted EIAs to outside agencies, which do a pretty poor job of actually telling you what the biodiversity in the area is. And on top of that, when you present the biodiversity value of the area, bureaucrats are not really going to listen to this. The more effective way is what the Mollem movement is doing now, I think, and it's very heartening to see that it has to bring in people at the grassroots level and create these kinds of agitations, and that is really what the government will be scared by and willing to respond to. Should we be safe assuming that there could be cures for illnesses in these forests? And that's from a question from Fam. And could irreparably killing a chance to access these? Could we add to the pro-Mole narrative in that way? I'm not entirely sure what that question means. Cures for illnesses in these forests. Oh, I see. From a biological point of view, if you're asking whether the plants in the area are medicinal, and whether there is the chance to find more medicinal plants in the area, and therefore prioritize this area as worthy of conservation. Absolutely. Even today we are still discovering plants that have medicinal value, from not just plants but even fungi and bacteria that have medicinal value in treating a whole range of illnesses. And I would be 100% sure that the forests in Mole have species like this that have not been looked at in terms of their potential to be cures for human disease. Um, and that again, once the forest is fragmented and lost, there really will be no hope of finding these cures ever. So yes, definitely there are species there, there are fungi there, there are bacteria there, there are plants there that have great potential as bioresources for human beings to develop new drugs to combat illness.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Umesh. Can you hear me?
Well, thank you, Akshay, and thank you, everybody. I'm happy to take more questions if people have them.
If you have any questions, please feel free to unmute and ask or chat, whatever you prefer.
Umesh,
Oh, this is from Sinead.
uh, can you hear me? I have a question.
Yeah,
Yes.
go ahead.
So you said that the EIA was contracted to another organization, but the railway EIA was made by IISc itself. So in that case, can you please, throw some light on how an EIA made by such a premier institute does not get fact checked and there's such clear discrepancies with that EIA. Could you please explain that a bit?
Right. So the EIA is from IISc, and the EIA was, if I'm not wrong, only for the railway track. So one of the EIAs is not even available. That's the one for the power line, and the other EIA is from the road for the road. And yes, the EIA from IISc certainly has shortcomings. A large number of species have been missed out. I think there has been in a large number of taxonomy cases, like birds, for example, uh, that have not looked at secondary literature. For any EIA, you go into a forest for 2 or 3 days, you're obviously not going to be able to uh, comprehensively quantify or detect all the species that are there in the area, which is why you need to rely on secondary, bird lists from the area and so on, which the IISc EIA certainly seems to have overlooked. Um, and it's unfortunate that this has happened, and it's very good that there is a lot more scrutiny on this EIA, and the fact that people are looking at it very closely. And I am one of them who have made submissions to the ministry saying, we need a more comprehensive evaluation of this area rather than relying on this EIA from IISc alone. And especially because there are now 3 projects coming in, it's not enough to look at each of these projects in isolation. It's also essential to look at the joint impacts of these 3 projects. So at this point in time, actually, what would be required is a cumulative impact assessment for all of these projects acting together. And I think these EIAs that have been in the past, which which have been limited, are no longer, I think, even valid to be used as a tool for uh, deciding whether these projects should go through or not. I'm not sure if I've answered your question. If you could please type it into the box if there's anything else that you would like me to discuss, then I would be happy to do that. I'm sorry, I'm having some trouble with hearing. In the meanwhile, I think we have a question from Sinead to everyone, which is, um, can you comment on any pollution that infrastructure projects may bring about and its relationship with accelerated tree death, given that the forest density is so low in India? The Amazon has a microclimate of its own that to an extent combats some amount of pollution. It is a bit more dense as well, but we don't have that. So yes, there are going to be impacts of pollution because of the building of these roads and the widening of these railway tracks. There are going to be impacts on the trees and the plants living along the edges, especially of these fragments abutting the railway track and the road. One of the things that happens is the increase in particulate matter that goes into the air and then settles down on the leaves of these plants, and then really compromises photosynthesis from happening, and that leads to in time the death of these plants, as well as the prevention of regeneration of any saplings and seedlings, which are especially vulnerable at that young stage. So particulate matter definitely should have huge pollution from particulate matter should have impacts on tree survival. And I think we should remember that the Amazon, although I've presented a lot of studies from the Amazon, um, the Amazon is vast. So the amount of interior forest that is in the Amazon, the dense forest that is in the Amazon, in the interior with its own special microclimate, is also much, much huger than the kind of forest and the microclimates that we have. So these threats, if anything, if you look at these threats in the Amazon, like pollution, and you look at these threats in India and Mollem from pollution, it's very likely that our forests are going to have much greater um, impacts from pollution than the forests of the Amazon will. Another question from Lisa, which is, how do other countries go about with forest fragmentation and thoughtless government development, uh, and about wildlife crossings? So wildlife crossings, I'll just talk a little bit about that first. Wildlife crossings have been sort of promoted by infrastructure agents and by the government as sort of solving this problem. You have linear intrusions like highways and railway tracks coming in, and they just say we'll build 3 or 4 underpasses or overpasses, and species are going to cross them to move from one end of the forest to the other. Now, there is no evidence to suggest that these underpasses or overpasses actually do work. They might work for large species if those large species choose to use those underpasses or overpasses, for which we don't have evidence. But those overpasses and underpasses, which are really far apart from each other, they are going to have an effect on small species. The small species that reach edges where there are no underpasses. I mean, a beetle, for example, or a frog is not going to climb over, 20 meters of concrete to get to the other side of whatever the railway track or the road that is going through the forest is. So I mean, we cannot rely on underpasses and overpasses and say, all right, the government is doing this, and therefore everything is going to be all right. There's absolutely no reason to believe that. As far as forest fragmentation goes, generally in the tropics, other countries as well uh, have dealt with it, barring a few exceptions, pretty much the way that we are dealing with it. It is, like you say, thoughtless government development. It is government development in areas that are already natural habitats and pristine. So Indonesia, for example, and the island of Borneo is a good example. But Sumatra, Java, Borneo, massive forest fragmentation entirely because of oil palm plantations. Uh, Papua New Guinea faces the same problem, and uh, these are all countries in the tropics tend to be poor, uh, with people living at or below the poverty line, substantial proportions of the population. So I guess it's easier for governments to sell this idea of development, whereas a lot of research that has been coming out on the social, economic, and the cultural impacts of these forest expansion projects have shown massive effects on cultures and societies. For example, gender roles have been completely reversed, with women being relegated to more and more backbreaking labor because of the influx of these infrastructure projects. So these are effects that are unforeseen, but they come in these countries, tropical countries, because of this thoughtless government expansion. uh, where we have slightly more successful case studies of governments in the tropics being able to safeguard their lands, preventing the ingress of things like highways, railway lines, and so on, are countries like Costa Rica, uh, are countries like it's hard to even think of countries that have done a good job of in the tropics, of course. Whereas the more well-developed countries, they do have problems with politicians trying to push through things like fracking, oil exploration, and so on in fragile habitats. But in general, they tend to have much larger expanses of forest, and especially in Europe, uh, better ways of managing those forests so that the biodiversity within those forests does not get affected that much. uh, but places like India, places like the tropics, that's where most of the world's biodiversity is concentrated. So any impacts through infrastructure is going to have much larger effects on biodiversity than it would have in temperate, richer, more developed countries.
We have a follow-up question as well from Sinead, Umesh.
Uh-huh.
Eh, Uh, they ask, have you seen any successful cases of resistance against this?
Successful cases of resistance against um,
I'm guessing,
infrastructure projects.
I think so. I think it was referring to the question before what you answered. Yeah. Please
Oh, right.
correct me if
I
I'm
can
wrong.
see that
Yeah.
now. I mean, the shining example of a successful resistance is, of course, Silent Valley in Kerala, where a dam was going to be built, and really this grassroots movement in Kerala that I think, and one of the that was one of the events that really catapulted consciousness of biodiversity and forests into the public consciousness. And Silent Valley, really, the grassroots movement stopped that infrastructure project from coming in, and actually made sure that that sanctuary would be protected without any of these uh, developmental projects coming in. So that's the first thing that comes to my mind is Silent Valley. um, well, the other thing is from Goa itself. If you go back in time in Goa, and Nandini just informs me that the Nylon 666 protests were an example. After more than 25 licenses were guaranteed, thousands of people surrounding the Panchayat house demanding that the project be scrapped, just basically led to the company being ejected from the area. So I guess you don't have to go very far to look at successful efforts that really have resulted in the safeguarding of biodiversity, safeguarding of projects, and the expulsion of these infrastructure companies that would cause harm to biodiversity. Fam has another question. Have you ever had acid rain in India like in Europe? That was catastrophic for both forests and people alike, all linked to carbon based energy. I'm sorry, I really do not know. I know that there have been events of acid rain in India, and I suspect that the places where acid rain was actually found to have occurred would have been cities or villages where people are actually monitoring, the rain, and the acid rain comes down, and it's important for people's health and so on. I am not. I'll have to check if we've ever had acid rain events over forest areas and what impacts those might have had on forests. Sorry, uh, I'm not familiar with that at all. If people have more questions, if people want to stay on and discuss these issues more, I'm happy to do it. So uh, the uh, the successful movement, resistance movement in Goa was the Nylon 666 movement. So I haven't read about that much myself, but if you would like to look at it in more detail, then I guess there's literature available on the Nylon 666 movement.
Do we have any further questions? And Umesh, if anyone has questions, can they reach out to you? And if so, how? Uh, do we have any more questions? Okay, if there are no questions, I guess we can call it a wrap. Oh, we have a comment. So the comment goes, a suggestion movements like My Mollem have happened in the past and will happen in the future. Why not make it a national movement to give it a strong support and voice? Umesh, you want to comment on that? Umesh?
Gita says
Yeah.
there's a suggestion that, like the My Mole movement that's ongoing at the moment, why not make it a national movement to give it a stronger support and a stronger voice? Um, Certainly, there is value in having a large national level movement to create awareness uh, and to bring these issues to the fore. And that will require a whole lot more coordination, that will require a teaming up with multiple stakeholders from across the country. And that's something we've not had really in India at all, where we've had some kind of national outpouring of resistance specifically towards the environment and forests and biodiversity. Um, you know, change often occurs, at these local levels where you can pressurize your MLA or your MP, and that then becomes a large issue. So I think what the Mollem movement is doing is great, because it's really put politicians on the back foot. Uh, so, but then I don't know what exactly happens when you scale it up to the national movement, national level.
Thanks, Umesh. Thanks. Any other questions? All right. Nandini has a comment, so we'll be wrapping up soon. But Umesh can be reached on umesh.srinivasan@gmail.com. You can take note of that. It's in the chat. And thank you all for coming, and thank you so much, Umesh, for this amazing talk. It was very accessible, and yeah. So I guess we can wrap up now. Thank you all. I'll just stop recording.